So today's a fun topic, but I also want to give a little bit of a would it be a warning or disclaimer that the subject of sexuality can be triggering for folks. So just take care of yourselves. I might be talking about topics that could be bring up things for you. And I by no means mean to harm anyone or um, trigger anyone's emotions, but this is part of our practice, looking in the places in our lives that are scary, and also very enjoyable. Yeah, so our practice of Zen has many stages to it, and depending on where someone is in their practice, they will orient to aspects of who they are as a person and to the practice in a very different way. So I know that uh, when I first started practicing meditation seriously, I was really simply looking for stability of my mind and my body and my emotions and my life in general. And I wasn't particularly looking to go look in the dark places in my psyche, uh, because I just didn't have the capacity for that at the time. So it really depends on where someone is in their practice as to their readiness to see um, what might be really uncomfortable, and maybe not even understand why we would want to do that. I think maybe all of us, most of us probably in this room and online, can relate to the sense of maybe when we started practicing, we had some vision of ourselves becoming these super peaceful, calm people, or wanting to be these super peaceful, calm people where there's nothing ever stirs again, and we just have this flat, sort of joyful, peaceful experience for the rest of our life. And as we know, as our practice develops, that's not the case. We have much more access to that, and it definitely spreads into our life more readily and fully. But equanimity is not flatlining. Equanimity is the experience of storms coming and going, and but just not being thrown off by them as much as we were at one time. And how we get to that is learning how to handle the storms. So we have to be willing to experience them, but then also go seek them out. Yeah, so our practice is leaving no stone unturned, no dark corners without light. And this includes our sexuality. So and I'll say that any energy that is repressed or suppressed becomes twisted and distorted. And, our teachers here at Great Mountain Zen Center have written a whole book about this, The Great Heart Way, and how any of our emotional wounding from childhood, anything that we feel during the day that we avoid and don't attend to, uh, can turn into anxiety, can turn into depression, can turn into harmful actions or addictions or compulsive behaviors to avoid dealing with that emotional energy that wasn't really dealt with. And this topic of sexuality does seem to get little press in Buddhism. Let's see, I think somebody want to come in. Yeah, so it gets a little press, and so this precept of not misusing sexuality, often we think immediately of, okay, infidelity, um, sexual assault, child abuse, polygamy. Those are the kind of standout, socially unacceptable forms of sex, at least in our culture. And many of us probably aren't partaking in those things. Maybe we have in the past, some infidelity here and there, but it's not like a regular patterned thing. And so we're like, okay, I got this precept. Let's move on. What's the next precept? But I really want to look more deeply into this precept and use it as a window to uncover unconscious material, ego structures that might be there that we might not be aware of. And the reason for that is because any kind of ego structure that's there, that's that has the intention to suppress and repress energy, is keeping us from experiencing liberation, freedom. So if we go seeking these things out, we can find these walls, we can find these gates that are continuing to close us in and hold us from experiencing that internal freedom that's possible. But let's look back at some of the Buddhist teachings on sexuality. So the Buddha taught the 5 precepts for lay practitioners in the beginning, during his life, and he said, "Further, monks, or actually, I guess this was to the monks, a noble disciple gives up sexual misconduct and abstains from it. By abstaining from sexual misconduct, the noble disciple gives to immeasurable beings freedom from fear. This is the 3rd of those great gifts and the 6th stream of merit." So here there's an idea of sexual misconduct and how it actually affects other people. So there's a sense of service here in terms of how we relate to our sexuality. And then there's the Bodhisattva observances, and I'll get back to some things that the Buddha said here in a second, but the Bodhisattva observances are in the Theravada tradition. Lay people, householders, take on monastic precepts for a certain number of days every week or every month. And one of them is abstaining from sexual relations. So he says, as long as they live, the arhants abandon sexual relations and observe celibacy, living apart, refraining from the coarse practice of sexual intercourse. Today, I too, for this day and night, will do likewise. So this is a practice that people who do engage in sexuality in certain countries will do at times. And then this is on the Buddhist teachings on conduct that leads to a good rebirth. Householders, it is by reason of unrighteous conduct not in accordance with the Dhamma, that some beings here, on the breakup of the body after death, are reborn in a state of misery and a bad destination in the lower world, in hell. It is by reason of righteous conduct in accordance with the Dhamma, that some beings here, on the breakup of the body after death, are reborn in a good destination in a heavenly world. And how, householders, are there 3 kinds of unrighteous bodily conduct? Conduct not in the accordance with the Dhamma. Here, someone kills living beings. He is murderous, bloody-handed, given to blows and violence, merciless to living beings. He takes, so the precept of not killing, he takes what is not given. He takes by way of theft the wealth and property of others in the village or forest. So here the precept of not taking what is not offered. And then he commits sexual misconduct. He has intercourse with women who are protected by their mother and father, brother, sister, or relatives, who have a husband, who are protected by law, and even with those already engaged. That is how there are 3 kinds of unrighteous bodily conduct not in accordance with the Dhamma. Here's another place that I found something about sexuality. Again, with sensual pleasures as the cause, men break into houses, plunder wealth, commit burglary, ambush highways, seduce others' wives, and when they are caught, kings have many kinds of torture inflicted on them, whereby they incur death or deadly suffering. Kind of intense. Let's see. Just a couple more things here from the Buddha. So this is on sensual pleasures in general. On a later occasion, having understood as they really are the origin, the passing away, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in the case of sensual pleasures, I abandoned craving for sensual pleasures. I remove the fear of sensual pleasures, and I dwell without thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace. I see other people who are not free from lust for sensual pleasures, being devoured by craving for sensual pleasures, burning with the fever of sensual pleasures, indulging in sensual pleasures, and I do not envy them, nor do I delight therein. Why is that? Because there is Magandiya, because he was having conversation with Magandiya, a delight apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, which surpasses even divine bliss. Since I take delight in that, I do not envy what is inferior, nor do I delight therein. So in these words from the Buddha, we see that there are multiple facets to sexuality from his perspective. How harmful behavior, such as having sex with another person's partner, can lead to rebirth in a hell realm or a lower rebirth in general. How indulging in sensual pleasures creates a cycle of chasing after more sensual pleasures, which distracts one from spiritual practice and the potential for feeling higher states of blissful absorption. That there are higher forms of pleasure than sensual pleasure, and that there are different suggestions for monastics and householders. Monastics are expected to maintain celibacy, and householders are expected to keep their sexual activity limited to their married partners and include celibacy for certain days of the month. So that's a chunk from the Buddha. But Zen is a Mahayana practice. And so in the Mahayana, we have the teachings of emptiness from Bodhidharma. And the Buddha did talk about shunyata, which is emptiness, but he talked about it more related to impermanence. And Bodhidharma talked about emptiness in a very different way. And then this is where the Mahayana movement came from, and the Heart Sutra. And we have this idea of no ear, or no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. Or you could say no sex, no wrong sex, no right sex, no precepts, no infidelity, and so on. That these things conceptually do not actually exist, and they're only a fabrication in our limited perception of mind. So if we go from that angle, if we go, so there's the Buddhist side of things, which is a little more sort of like prescriptive, and then we go to the emptiness side of things, which is none of this really exists anyway, except as fabrications in our mind. We can get ourselves into a little bit of trouble. So you might have some rigidity on one side and maybe a little too loose on the other side. And so this idea of the middle way arises, which is really the perfect practice for the householder, the lay practitioner. And the person who's in the world in relationship with other human beings, having jobs, and carrying on in the world. So there's, this old story of the Buddha hearing a mentor and a mentee floating by or walking by and talking about the strings of the instrument not being too tight and not too loose. Now, that middle way is different for every single person here. Every person who's listening to this talk, every person on this planet, that middle way is different. There's not a middle way. And that middle way is impermanent. It's constantly shifting and changing based off of where our practice is at the time. So early in someone's practice, they may really need some rigid rules to help keep them from engaging in misconduct that can be harmful to others, but especially to themselves, and just create more karma for themselves. So they might need some serious rigidity on what they can and can't do. So, that's why it's very helpful in the Japanese system, where these monks go and they basically go for 3 years and they don't leave the monastery for 3 years to do their initial training, so that when they are accessing emptiness, they're not just going out and like, all right, I'm free, what are we gonna do? There's some a container to help them go through some of the stages of practice. But as practice moves on, less rigidity is needed, because a lot of that karmic twisting is untwisting, and our intentions and our actions become more aligned with, well, you could say that we become more aware of our internal feedback system, our internal social feedback system of healthy guilt, healthy shame, healthy awareness of how we affect others, compassion, loving kindness, and wisdom. So all those things become more readily available. And so we don't need these external things holding us so tightly anymore. And so I actually want to step into the realm of Tantra. And here I'm not talking about Vajrayana Tantra, I'm talking about the general idea of Tantra. Do you know what that means? Do you understand the idea of Tantra is different from Mahayana or different from Theravada practice? Yeah, so there's the Hinayana, the Mahayana, and then in Zen we often talk about what we call the Buddhayana, but you could also say Vajrayana. And the Hinayana, which isn't Theravada, it's not fair to say. So Hinayana means smaller vehicle, Mahayana means greater vehicle, and then the Tantrayana or the Buddhayana is the I don't know what the exact translation is, not coming to my mind right now, but it's the vehicle beyond, or the all-inclusive vehicle. And so in the Hinayana, it's like celibacy, we're transcending the body. The body is not a healthy place. It's where all the suffering happens. We're transcending the body by avoiding all the sensual desires. So we only eat what's given to us. No sex, no owning anything, no having money. So you have no opportunity to crave anything that you can buy. So you become this very, I guess you could say passive, but you could just say very surrendered experience. In the Mahayana, we step into the realm of service. So we have emptiness. There's, there's emptiness, but there's also this aspect of service and serving others. And we do have the Bodhisattva precepts in the Mahayana. So in the Bodhisattva precepts are less of a rigid rule and more of a guideline in helping us look at where we can get caught. But then the Tantrayana it's almost like let's look at where are the cravings. Let's dive into them. Let's have them and then go into them and feel them directly and transform that craving energy into wisdom. So instead of avoiding, you dive right into it. So you probably heard of tantric sex and things like that. And so there is a practice of that in the Vajrayana tradition, that when people get to a certain level of practice, they learn practices to involve the practice into sexuality. But for example, in the Vajrayana tradition, they'll have these giant feasts and they just have all kinds of food and meat and everything on the table. And there's just incredible amounts of abundance and you just go for it and you just do your practice and feel it as you're just, experiencing that feeling of grasping and clinging and wanting and desire. So here in the Boulder area, the Vajrayana is Shambhala is a Vajrayana tradition, and there's like 30 some Buddhist groups in Boulder County or something like that, and many of them are Tibetan Buddhist groups. And so in this area, there's a lot of, even in the Zen communities, there's a lot of influence from this tantric of the world practice. In the world practice. And the idea, I guess one more thing I want to say about that is that if there's anger, if there's greed, it's not like you do an antidote to the greed. You take that greed and you feel it directly, and feeling it directly and bringing awareness to it directly naturally transforms that greed into generosity or into whatever it needs to become for that particular person. And there's a trust, a faith in one's own being versus a hatred or a fear or an avoidance of one's own being. And there's an acknowledgement and a faith that inside my own body is the wisdom. And if I actually come into my body and be my body, and experience it directly, I have faith that the wisdom will actually come out of that awareness and out of that unity with the body. So in our practice here at Great Mountain Zen Center, it's rare that you'll find our teachers here talking about rules that you have to follow. And in fact, they're often encouraging us to explore and make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and find that edge of what feels right and what feels wrong from our own sense of right and wrong that comes from our own bodies. So in the koan training, doing koan after koan after koan after koan and going to your teacher and just presenting whatever you got, even if you don't have anything walking through that door, you sit down and you just say, my practice is mu, and that's what you give. Like, that's what I got right now. And it's this practice of getting in touch with this energetic wisdom that just comes right out of our body, way before it ever touches the conceptual part of our brains. And over time, you practice that and practice that and practice that, and you develop faith and trust in that, and you make this shift from having rules for yourself to really trusting in your own sense of being and acting in the world. And you get feedback over and over again, like, oh, this is actually working. I can trust this. This is okay. And then you, and then a larger shift happens where that becomes the place where you just naturally function from. So, getting into sexuality, and where I go with this with the precept is that rules and precepts, even though they're meant to help, can actually hurt when we take them on as a rule of something that I shouldn't be doing, because then I'm a bad person, and we can get into this moral realm, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And so this precept isn't, I think in all religious circles that I've seen and been a part of all the aspects of the human being, sexuality seems to be the most confusing, in terms of like, how does this relate to spirituality? And there's this idea that maybe even like, oh, I can't get enlightened if I'm actually having sex if I have a sexual life. I have to give that up, and I have to transform that sexual energy into something else to get enlightened. And that's not the tantric view. That's not the view here at this Zen Center. So it's important to use this precept to look into our sexuality, to see, because we can use sexuality harmfully against ourselves, and have misconduct about ourselves if we're not engaging healthily with our sexual energy, which doesn't necessarily have to be an action, but it's just, any kind of repression or suppression of that sexual energy is going to be harmful to us. So sex, this word sex, is not limited to intercourse between a man and a woman. I think most of us are aware of that at this point. But how about this idea? Sex can actually be any act or thought that has the intention or manifestation of the arousal of the genitals. and the successive pleasurable and energetic sensations that course through the body. So, if someone gets off by having a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, that would be sex for that person. That would be a sexual activity that they're engaging in, right? If somebody has arousal from watching Dragnet, that for them is a sexual activity. Okay. You ever seen the movie Kinsey? You ever heard of Alfred Kinsey? So Alfred Kinsey was a scientist. Originally, he was maybe doing research on butterflies or some type of moth or something like that. And then through his own sexual repression and liberation, he got really interested in sexuality and did tons of research in the 50s, or actually, I think it was in 1948. 1948. He published a book on his scientific studies that he'd been doing for many, many years, and it basically started this sexual revolution that came out in the 60s and 70s. And what he found was that across humanity, the most conservative of people, everybody he talked to, very few people's fantasies, sexual fantasies and actions were actually limited to heterosexual male-female sex. That like most people had fantasies about same sex or animals or sexual experiences in nature, all kinds of stuff, group sex, sex with parents, sex with older people, sex with younger people, sex with different races, sex across ethnicities, that people's minds and their interests were just all over the place. And what it really spoke to was the diversity that happens within human sexuality. And this created this sort of like, oh, I mean, this was like, I think it was the #1 best-selling book that came out that year and sold millions of copies or something like that. There's the Kinsey, Liam Neeson plays the main character in the movie. It's a very well done movie, but there's also multiple documentaries online. And I have my students at Naropa watch these movies and get some education around it. And so if that's our reality, if that's the reality that's happening inside most human beings, then why is it that we have so many rules around it? Why is it that we have so much suppression and repression around it in religious communities, in government, and all this? And so we're in this juxtaposition between being in a social environment where we all have norms that we kind of have to agree to and live by so that we don't go around hurting each other and stealing from each other and, you know, doing things that our natural desirous ways want to be. And somehow in certain cultures, sex got to be one of the most, what would you say, controlled forms of human expression, probably because people are going around having sex with everybody and people are getting hurt because we are we are beings that have emotions and that we can feel hurt very easily. And we do get attached to other beings, and so it's hurtful when someone, you know, goes off with somebody else, when we think that we're the ones that they would love. So there's probably a lot of different reasons that I'm not aware of, that are very deep in our psychology, but also in human sociology as to why there's so much control around it. So here's an interesting example. So now polyamory is becoming more and more common. In fact, I just met with a couple this week who are wanting to do polyamory in a healthy way for them. And I've gotten multiple referrals in the last few weeks of couples like this. And so polygamy, where you actually can marry multiple people, is often thought of as a man with multiple wives. That's how it seems to be practiced in the US in certain subcultures in the US, even today, even though it's illegal. But what if polyamory became polygamous? Like you had a few trans people, a few women, a few men, a few people who identify in different ways in their gender. 10 people all wanted to be married together. Why not? What's the problem with that? What if they wanted to do that? Legally, it's illegal. It's illegal. It would definitely throw off our tax system. It would definitely create some problems in that way. But what mental construct is getting in the way? What social construct is getting in the way of that? Is it a religious thing? Are we scared of it? What would be fearful about that for us? It's not something I'm interested in personally. I'm very monogamous in my own ways of relating. But a lot of people aren't. A lot of people are naturally polyamorous. So our path as practitioners is towards freedom, not suppression. Psychologically, we need to know ourselves as completely as possible in order to be free. So it's not just sitting on the cushion doing our practice, it's also being very curious. Why did I do that? Why did I have that interaction with that person that didn't go well? Why is it that when I masturbate, I feel guilt? Why is it that when I masturbate, I fantasize about this thing, yet in my actual sexual life, I do this thing? What is going on inside of me that does that? And if I'm avoiding something there, how might that be showing up in my life in other ways? How is that guilt showing up and on a psychically, on an energetic level? This week I've been giving teachings in my classes on radical acceptance, non-judgmental awareness, and unconditional positive regard. And I teach in the mindfulness-based transpersonal program at Naropa University. And so we use meditation as practitioners, as therapists, to learn how to completely accept everything that I am as a practitioner. And as you all, as Zen practitioners, that's part of our practice. Oh, I'm feeling sad. I can feel sad. I don't need to push that away. I don't need to do anything about it. I can just feel the sadness. I feel happy about something. I can just feel that. I don't need to do anything with it. I don't have to make it more happy. I don't have to say, oh, I shouldn't be feeling happy about that. I can just drop the story of it and feel happy. Oh, I have murderous thoughts. Okay, most people do at some point in their life or multiple times in their life. There's all kinds of stuff that happens in our minds and in our bodies that our practice is to just 100% completely be with, accept, love, have compassion for, be curious about. So when I bring this up, you don't have to answer, just, what in your own self, what in your own mind, where are the place that you're like, this is okay, this realm of stuff is okay, but this realm of stuff is not. And who out there in the world is maybe on our not okay list? Which groups of people are in our okay list and which groups are out? It's these karmic knots. It's these stuck places in our minds and bodies that can keep us from experiencing emptiness. My experience is that wherever the karmic knots are, they turn into thoughts. They turn into anxieties, they turn into depressions, they turn them into shame and stories about them. And so the more my mind is going, the less access I have to space, to experiencing non-dual reality. And the more work that I've done in therapy, the more work I've done on the cushion and like being completely with all my painful emotions and doing the great heart work, the less I feel those emotions on a toxic level. The more they just kind of come naturally as healthy shame comes and goes, healthy guilt comes and goes. And there's just so much more space accessible. And what's interesting, Sigmund Freud, uh, you know, it's easy to look back and say, okay, he had a lot of issues. But at that time, he was doing something that was very profound and new. Okay. And he was exploring new territory. He also lived in a very patriarchal society at the time, which we do now, but more then. So he had a certain cultural view that he was coming from. But in early psychoanalysis, a lot of the focus was on people's sexual lives. And that was the window into seeing everything else. And what I've learned for myself and what I've learned in working with lots of clients is that if you want to see if you want to get the deepest glimpse into our unconscious that we have available to us, look at our sexuality. Look what happens when we are actually with another person or with ourselves engaging in sexuality, what we're drawn to do, what we're afraid of, what we like, what we don't like. And so much of our deep unconscious psychology shows up right there in front of us. So in the opposition to misusing sexuality or sexual misconduct or unwholesome behavior is sexual health. And I'm definitely not here to tell you what that is. That's something that every person explores for themselves. But I could tell you one guideline that I would offer is that if it's harmful to you or if it's harmful to somebody else, then it's probably not healthy sexuality. It doesn't mean that we don't have a desire to engage in that type of sexuality and that the desire itself is not necessarily unhealthy, but the manifestation of it might be unhealthy. And it might be unhealthy only because of current social norms or laws, because unhealthy means like, well, I don't want to end up in prison for doing something, and because that wouldn't be fun or good for me. Even though both the people might be doing something that's very consensual. Here's an example too, pornography. So even when I just say that word, notice what happens for you around that word. Maybe nothing happens. Maybe excitement happens. Maybe distaste happens. Many, many, many millions of people around the world watch pornography every day. When I saw the statistics on how many people watch pornography, I was blown away. It went from being, before the internet, it went from being this sort of like, seemed like this sort of like dirty subculture to like pretty common everyday stuff for most people around the world. My clients talk about it a lot. People watch it alone. People watch it with their partners. It brings life to sexual relationships that have died when people have been together a long time and they kind of lost interest. Sometimes people will turn to porn to, get things moving again in a long relationship. It helps people see new ways that sex can happen, and it makes them curious, and then they try new things with their partners. There's also a whole side of porn that is um, non-consensual, where the participants in the videos are sex trafficked and being filmed and things like that. There's also people who are the actors in pornography that make a career of it. They raise kids off of it. When I lived in Las Vegas for 4 years, I went in with like, oh my God, Vegas is like the dirtiest place in the whole world. And I came out with like this open mind because I met many people who were dancers, strippers, or did things like that, who grew up in rough situations as kids, didn't have the privilege to go to college, but now they can actually afford a house. They can raise kids. They can send their kids to private school if they want to, and they can live a life that other privileged people had access to due to education and training, parental training. And there was even on NPR, I remember this very vividly because it was one of the moments that sort of like opened my mind a little bit, was on NPR. I was driving in Vegas listening to NPR one day, and they interviewed a UNLV student who had a child, and she was stripping on like Thursday, Friday, and Saturday nights and making like 2,000 a night kind of thing, putting herself through college and raising a kid. And I just really empathize with what it must be like for that person to have been in that position, to like, that's what I have available to me. And then looking at what she did with it. I also heard on NPR, I love NPR. I also heard on NPR an interview with a professional prostitute who lived in San Francisco, who had multiple clients for many, many years. And many of these people were men who just didn't have the social skills and the ability to have healthy long-term relationships. But she was able to provide this opportunity for them. And yeah, again, it just opened my eyes to the possibilities. And also it showed me sort of where some of my barriers were in seeing the whole realm of humanity and what people are up to and have been up to for thousands of years. One of the things that happens, and I'll be finished here in just a minute, in a few minutes. One of the things that can happen is that we have this set of internal rules that we develop as children that are in conflict with another part of ourself. So classic example is if somebody grew up in a conservative Christian environment or any conservative religious environment, and homosexuality was this bad, evil thing, yet internally they realize that they're gay. There can be this internal conflict of, in psychology we call them parts, where one part is like, no, that's bad, you shouldn't do that, you're going to go to hell. And the other part's like, but this is who I am. Like, this is what I'm into. Like, I don't want to be in a heterosexual relationship for the rest of my life. I'm not, like, I'll die. My soul will die. And this internal conflict can happen. So I think because of the cultural dynamics, the religious dynamics that many of us grew up in, this kind of internal conflict can be happening for us sexually, with our sexuality. So and this is where meditation can really come in, is we get to hear those voices and we get to be curious about them, and we get to feel that guilt and we get to feel that shame, and we also get to feel that desire and see where that desire naturally wants to go. So here's some questions just to kind of, maybe it helps you explore something in yourself. So what morals do you have about sexuality? What are the ones that you hold? What direct or indirect messages were you taught about sex as a child? What is your relationship to masturbation? Do you feel guilt when you masturbate, or do you avoid masturbation completely due to a feeling of dirtiness? Do you have sexual fantasies that you would feel shameful to share with others or that you feel ashamed about having? Do you have sexual interests that do not fit the cultural norms? And how do you feel about those? What types of energies are common in your fantasies, such as power dynamics, submission, connection, excitement, shyness, warmth? So, in working with sexual energy, suggested practice from me is to feel it directly, just like everything else. Every other feeling, sensation that we have in our body, we can feel it directly. We don't have to act on it. This is definitely not a talk about like, hey, y'all should go out to the ranch down in Denver and go for a swing evening, unless you want to. But that's not my point. My point is really to explore the internal experience of our lives. Sometimes we have to, to work through karma, we have to act in the world on it for it to actually to fully engage in the internal experience of it. But I definitely wouldn't encourage you to do anything that's harmful to yourself or anyone else. But it's really this exploration of this energy within ourselves. We can do what's called surfing the urge. This is a phrase that's used in the addiction worlds. When a craving arises for a substance and they're like, oh, I really want alcohol right now, or I really want to get high. There's an urge that happens in the body and we can surf that. We can feel that and ride that wave until it dissipates. We can also explore how our interests relate to childhood relationships with our parents and our caregivers, and what kind of dynamics were happening there, what we didn't get from our caregivers that we're seeking in our sexual relationships. Therapy is often, a very helpful place to go to talk about these things. And partner, it's really wonderful if we have, a partner or partners who see this everything as the spiritual path. And then there's freedom and opportunity to explore within the relationship our unconscious stuff. And there's some tiptoeing around that needs to happen. Some care and a lot of communication is really important in those types of situations. But these are all Dharma gates, Dharma gates are omnipresent. I vow to experience them, or is it Dharma gates are omnipresent. I vow to experience these ones, but not those ones. Yeah, I'll conclude with this. As I've said this before in some previous talks, is that our true nature, we talk about true nature a lot, our true nature includes our biological nature. So when you experience emptiness, emptiness isn't voidness. Emptiness is the totality of everything as one functioning universe, one functioning thing. When we get out of the way of our own mind, we experience non-duality. That's emptiness. Non-duality isn't voidness. Non-duality is seeing everybody right here without any preconceptions, without any ideas about who we are. So in that, we're not negating our own biological natures. Our sexuality, our cravings, our drives, all of that stuff. It's all part of the deal. It's all part of the package. If we're fighting it, we're fighting reality. We're fighting emptiness. We're fighting what is. We're fighting thusness. And we're just creating a barrier between us and enlightenment, in my opinion. So that's all I have to say. So thank you all for listening.